This is the introductory education programme for supporters of FRFI. Its structure serves its purpose by establishing the need for organisation in order to meet the crisis of capitalism and fight for socialism. This programme is in no way fixed and is open to suggestions. It remains therefore a work in progress. It is being discussed in open forums across the country where FRFI supporters are active. In section 2 we ask, what is Marxism? To quote Karl Marx from his thesis on Feuerbach, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This section introduces Marx and Engels' theory of the process of history, of historical dialectical materialism. We examine how Marxism allows us not only to analyse the class struggles at the heart of our society, but most importantly, shows us how capitalism, like feudalism before it, is just one phase in the history of the development of social production, destined to be overthrown by the revolutionary working class. Marxism is a science, not a dogma, enriched continually by the practical experience of radical struggle. It is the means by which the current crisis of capitalism can both be understood and overcome in the interests of the socialist transformation of society. So let's go ahead and look at two of the articles that have been picked out from FRFI for section 2. This article, titled The Communist Manifesto, is from issue number 142 of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, the newspaper of the Revolutionary Communist Group, which was published in April 1998. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Such words might seem odd to us, 8 years after the collapse of the socialist countries, and 9 months into the most reactionary Labour government. According to the ruling class, when the socialist bloc was destroyed, history ended, the ideas of communism were a failure, and capitalism was here to stay. This triumphalism is no longer tenable, as recessions and financial crisis threaten the world with ruin. The tiger economies of Asia have collapsed, and imperialism has failed to reintroduce viable capitalism into Eastern Europe. It is in this context that the Communist Manifesto, published 150 years ago, gains renewed importance. Adam Sherwood celebrates a document of such power and vision. It can help us to change the world. The manifesto was published on the eve of revolutions that spread across Europe, overthrowing monarchies and bringing the bourgeoisie to power. In 1848, talk was not of stability, but of revolution. As the manifesto states, all that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. It was easy to see that the bourgeoisie had not always been the ruling class, and that its ideas had not always reigned supreme. The modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. At the very beginnings of bourgeois rule, Marx and Engels were able to foresee the failings of a capitalist society and the way forward to a new society. This vision enraged the propertied elites. Quote, "You are horrified our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. At the time, Europe's impoverished masses bore the brunt of a trade slump. The manifesto exposes the bourgeois hypocrisy. Quote, "All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favour of bourgeois property. And it takes sides. Quote, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend." Marx and Engels envisaged a society based not on profit and ruthless competition, but on cooperation and mutual development. They proposed a world in which workers would not be thrown on the scrap heap when they are no longer needed for production, but where they have democratic control over their lives and are valued as individuals. Quote, "In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." Cuba shows the superiority of socialist organisation, even in the face of extreme economic hardship. Socialist organisation means that today in Cuba, a third world country blockaded by the US, not one single hospital or school has been closed. No one sleeps on the streets, and Cuba has one of the lowest infant mortality rates in the world. Despite many shortages, what they have, they share, and no one is rejected. This is the alternative form of social organisation of which the manifesto spoke. The consequences of not achieving this society are bleak indeed. This year, 14 million children under the age of 5 will die from malnutrition and preventable disease. Every day, 25,000 people die from waterborne disease. The choice today, as it was in 1848, is socialism or barbarism. a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or the common ruin of the contending classes. Where Marx and Engels made a great advance was that they did not just raise a moral indignation at the horrors of bourgeois rule. For the first time, the Manifesto shows us how the capitalist economy is to develop. The colonial scramble of the late 19th century is foreseen. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. Eventually, even the global domination by capital of resources and markets is not enough to support its insatiable drive to expand, and the whole edifice comes tumbling down. Marx and Engels charted the historic progress of humanity and provided a scientific analysis of the inevitability of the rise of capitalism from feudalism and its death in the birth of socialism 20 years before. Quote, modern bourgeois society, with its relations of productions, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and exchange, is like the sorcerer, who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. The destruction of society that occurs progressively in each crisis leaves capital less and less room to manoeuvre. With each crash, it becomes harder to re-establish profitable industry until the question of revolution can no longer be delayed. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on trial, each time more and more threateningly. The stock market crash of 1987, the Mexican peso crisis of 1995, and most recently the currency and stock market crash of Southeast Asia show what is in store. And then of course, since this article was written, there was the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent housing crisis we still find ourselves in today. Along with the necessity for revolution, capitalist society produces the agents of revolution, the working class, as agents of change. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Freed from any ties to property, the working class have nothing to sell but their labour power, forming a class in opposition to the capitalists. It is the working class, who have no stake in the capitalist system, who can give a lead to all the oppressed to throw off the yoke of capital and build a socialist society. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The Communist Manifesto was written to give ideological expression to the working class as a whole and to organise it into politically independent parties. The Communists have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own. The immediate aim of the Communists is the formation of the proletariat into a class, the overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, and conquest of political power by the proletariat. Marx and Engels understood that in this struggle, the working class would have to seize state power and would have to confront all existing social relations. Quote, the proletariat, the lowest stratum of a present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. The Manifesto warned against any illusions in the neutrality of the state in this conflict between classes. Quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. During the miners' strike of 1984-85, the state organised the police into a paramilitary force to occupy mining towns, attack and imprison strikers, and prevent them from travelling to picket working pits. In the 6 counties of Ireland, the British Army's record of torture, murder, internment without trial, and willingness to allow loyalist terrorism belies any suggestion of impartiality. Following the defeat of the first working class seizure of power in the Paris Commune of 1871, Marx and Engels were to make their only amendment to the Manifesto, when they added, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, viz. That the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The bourgeois state has to be smashed. It is unreformable. For many petty bourgeois commentators on the left today, this historic revolutionary role of the working class is denied or distorted by Eurocentrism. Eric Hobsbawm, writing in The Guardian on the 28th of February 1998, states, it is now evident that the bourgeoisie has not produced, above all, its own gravediggers in the proletariat. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat have not proved equally inevitable. Why was it inevitable that it could not provide a livelihood, however miserable, for most of the working class, or alternatively, that it could not afford a welfare system? For sure, it could, in Western Europe. Yet today, welfare systems are being dismantled, threatening extreme misery for the working class. Martin Jack, formerly of the Communist Party of Great Britain, speaking on Radio 4 on the 7th of March, said that the last workers who were arbiters of change were in Europe in the 1950s. What he thinks of the heroic struggles of the Korean, Cuban, and Vietnamese working classes, we can only conjecture. All these physicians recognise only the more secure and better paid sections of the working class. These workers, traditionally organised in the European labour movements, have enjoyed a comfortable existence at the expense of the people of oppressed nations. The more oppressed sections of the working class, the lowest stratum of our society, does not exist for these bourgeois commentators. They ignore the majority of the world's population, capitalism's victims who live in abject poverty, the 1.2 billion who earn less than $1 a day, the 180 million under fives who suffer from malnutrition, or the 1 in 3 who have no safe drinking water. Yet it is precisely this section of the working class that is growing, drawing in other sections. As this process accelerates, conditions more akin to those of 1848 or the Third World today will reoccur in Europe. Today in Britain, the largest difference in income levels has been recorded since records began in 1886. 13.7 million people live in poverty, and 31% live in a household where nobody is in full-time employment. This article was originally written in 1998, and since then, this process has carried on. Wage stagnation continues, and we're seeing a growing number of working people having to resort to using food banks to get by, as well as a growing number of homeless people and rough sleepers in Britain. It's not just that the poorer sections of the working class are suffering, but that they are being joined by previously privileged layers of the population. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Quote, "The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage labourers. As these middle-class elements return to the ranks of the working class, they present the working class with great potential and great danger. Those who make common cause with the oppressed will contribute to the building of a new revolutionary movement. Those who try to preserve their privileges will be forced into ever more desperate attacks on the working class to do so. Social democracy is increasingly untenable." Quote, "The lower middle class fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay, more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. Whatever outcome of the great historic battle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in the depth of the current crisis, one thing is certain. The more oppressed sections of the working class, from South Korea and Indonesia to Kurdistan and Turkey, from the 6 counties of Ireland to the heartland of British imperialism itself, will unite to resolutely oppose capitalism, for they have nothing to lose but their chains, and they have a world to win." For more FRFI articles, or to find out about the RCG, please go to our website, revolutionarycommunist.org. This next article, titled Basic Principles of Marxism, Part 3, Dialectical Materialism, is from FRFI issue 87, first published in June 1989. Dialectical materialism is the world outlook and method of scientific socialism. It holds that every natural, social, and intellectual formation is the transitory product of given material conditions, that all phenomena come into being, develop, and eventually perish as a result of the action of the contradictions within them. For Marx and Engels, dialectical materialism provided the means by which the illusions of religion could be dispelled. Philosophy could be retrieved from speculation to serve the liberation of humanity, and theory could be put on a scientific basis. Above all, dialectical materialism is the conception of the world which conforms with the interests of the self-emancipation of the working class and the struggle for communism and human fulfillment. All phenomena contain contradictions, which form the unity of opposites. Society is a unity of divided classes. Marx's philosophy is partisan, because reality is partisan. Thought and philosophy could not be neutral, because they're parts of a world in struggle. In our epoch, that struggle, and the principal contradiction determining the fate of humanity, is the struggle between capital and labour. Marx was adamant intellectuals could no longer pretend to be disengaged. Re-examining Marx's work on the German idealist philosopher Hegel and the materialist Feuerbach, Engels observed that the great basic question of all philosophy, especially of more recent philosophy, is the relation of thinking and being, of spirit to nature. Which is primary, spirit or nature? The answer, which the philosophers gave to this question, split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primacy of spirit to nature, and therefore, in the last instance, assumed world creation in some form or another, comprised the camp of idealism. The others, who regarded nature as primary, belong to the various schools of materialism. Materialists believe that nature or matter is primary to spirit or ideas. Working class suffering is a result of real material conditions. These conditions can be changed, and hated social systems overthrown to allow a new society to be built free from exploitation. Until people have seen the material class interests behind moral, religious, and political phrases, they will always be deceived and incapable of changing the conditions which they live to their maximum benefit. Breaking through this deception is the task of Marxism-Leninism. Idealism has customarily been the outlook of the ruling classes. In various forms it has depicted outstanding personalities, kings, generals, religious figures, geniuses, etc. as the real movers of history. Plato, for example, held that society should be ruled by philosopher kings. He saw the great creations of humanity as the work of individual sparks of divine inspiration. Nietzsche, like Plato, believed that although the masses are in ignorance and enemies of the truth, the individual can escape their snare. For idealism, insofar as the world changes, it is the movement of ideas. The suffering of the working class is not a consequence of their social conditions. Those conditions themselves derive from some inane quality or preordinated order, like race, greed, human nature, IQ, a fall from grace, lack of enterprise, etc. In Britain, idealism in the form of Hume and Berkeley, and in Germany in the work of Leibniz and Kant and Hegel, held sway in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Marx studied them and overthrew them. Kant recognised that matter exists and acts on our minds through the senses. Kant recognised that matter exists and acts on our minds through the senses, but maintained that mind consists of logical categories not derived from matter within which we arrange the data of sense perception. Thus, the order we see in nature is not part of it, but rather something the mind imposes upon it. Objective reality, the thing itself, is unknowable. So, the way in which we see the world, ideology, religion, etc., is not a product of social conditions, but something quite separate from it, with its own internal logic. In this way, what are in reality class positions present themselves as scientific, neutral and independent, etc. Against Kant, Hegel claimed that the world was fully knowable. Knowledge was a process which advances from the contradictions present in the appearance of things, which is resolved in their essence at a higher level of development. The action of contradictions took phenomena towards their real, true nature. Quantitative change would result in eventual qualitative change. Qualitative change is only possible as a negation of the previous condition. In turn, this stage will be negated. The negation of the negation demonstrates the progression from lower to higher forms, from simple to complex. Hegel applied his dialectical logic to science, history, philosophy. Only being an idealist, he regarded mind, not matter, as the sole reality. However, Hegel had broken with the metaphysical idealism that characterized much feudal thought. The latter was a conception of the world which depicted things in distinction and isolation from each other, denying their contradictory character and interconnections, and which stressed the unchanging character of the world, a view well suited to the rigid, unchanging feudal order. Inspired by the French Revolution, Hegel saw contradictions and change in everything, but for him, the evolution of material life was a process of thought, the unfolding of the idea or absolute spirit. Sublime reason thinking its way to establish a perfect rational order, which, in the case of Hegel, came to be personified by the Prussian state. So for Hegel, reason alone would destroy the illusions of ideology. Marx and reality have taught us that the confidence of the bourgeoisie in the universal qualities of the Great Enlightenment corresponded only with that time when the bourgeoisie were in the ascendance and claimed to represent all society and the future. Foul money spoke louder than sweet reason. Writing the afterword to the second edition of Capital, Marx expressed his relation to and critique of Hegel thus: "My dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man, and transferred into forms of thought. With him, it, the dialectic, is standing on its head, It must be inverted in order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Writing The Holy Family, Marx examined the dilemma of even the most sophisticated idealism. Why does the category fruit sometimes appear as apple, sometimes as almond, etc.? Because, says the idealist, fruit is a living thing, and its different sensual manifestations are nothing other than the changing consequences of the life process, fruit. The universal category fruit dissolves into the material expressions it gives itself. Apples, almonds, etc. are expressions of the idea fruit as it develops. Why did Greece fall? Because the central idea of Greek life, the idea of beautiful, was no longer believed by the people. Why not? Because it could not live in that form for so long. So runs idealism, and really nothing is explained. For Marx and Engels, the category fruit derives from human experience of different fruits. The idea of beautiful was a reflection of the changing, transitory social conditions of the ancient Greek state. Matter exists in motion. All matter, galaxies, plants, molecules, and society is a state of motion. Human beings are part of matter, as is consciousness, but exist in conflict with it. That conflict is conducted through production, which discloses humankind to itself. Dialectical materialism shows that people make history, not in order to unfold some concept or destiny within them, but in order to satisfy their needs. What these needs are, and how they are satisfied, are determined by the level of productive forces. As the level of these productive forces changes, so social relations change. Idealism sees economic relations as a function of human nature. Dialectical materialism sees economic relations as a function of the level of productive forces. Human nature is determined by the interaction of the productive forces and objective nature. Idealism might claim that a market economy conforms with human nature, a competitive self-interest, etc. Dialectical materialism states that a market economy conforms with a given level of productive force. As these forces develop, so will they conflict with the market form, and this economy will be in conflict with human nature. Matter exists independently of consciousness, and its laws apply, gravity, thermodynamics, etc., whether we know them or not. Marx and Engels demonstrated that society develops in accordance with certain laws, again whether people know of their existence or not. These laws are independent of human consciousness. The material conditions of existence, the level of productive forces, how we obtain food, make clothes, satisfy our needs, predetermine the intellectual and cultural pursuits of society. Together, the productive forces and relations of production form the mode of production. The relationship between the mode of production and ideologies and institutions is not a simple one of cause and effect. To quote Engels, political, legal, philosophical, religious, literary, artistic, etc. development is based on economic development. But all these react upon one another, and also upon the economic basis. One must not think that the economic situation is cause and solely active, whereas everything else is only passive effect. On the contrary, interaction takes place on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. The productive forces are the most mobile aspect of the mode of production. They, the tools, skills, organisational abilities, etc., develop faster than the productive relations of ownership and of control, and come into conflict with them. This conflict is resolved when new production relations replace old ones. Quantitative change gives rise to qualitative change, a negation of the negation. This is a law of human history. Only with the enormous development of the productive forces under capitalism does recognition of this law become possible. With this recognition, the working class can prepare to fulfill the task of socialism, the destruction of capitalist relations and the construction of a society based upon freely associated people consciously planning production for their needs. Long the object of history, the victim of blind laws, humanity becomes the subject, shaper of the world, in fashion with its developing needs and mastery of nature. Truth is provided in practice. Theory is tested by reality, and its truth is measured in its contribution to the human control of nature and society. To quote Engels again, freedom is the recognition of necessity. Necessity is blind only insofar as it is not understood. Just as Einstein's discoveries in physics confirm reality is dialectical, so the crisis of capitalism in the 20th century confirms the correctness of Marx and Engels' theory that the productive forces have outrun the relations in which they develop and have entered into a final conflict with them, the outcome of which will determine the fate of humanity. Thanks again for listening, and for more FRFI articles and to find the texts from which we draw our analysis, please visit revolutionarycommunist.org/Marxism. And please don't hesitate to go on our website, click on the Join the RCG button to get in touch, find out about our public meetings and get involved in street work.